All right, so for this last question, it talks about comparing and contrasting the different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So what I thought I'd do is start by drawing a little chart here that describes all the aspects of the nervous system, just kind of a basic outline here. So on this side we have peripheral, and this side we have the central nervous systems. And under the central, we just have two divisions that we won't talk much about, but we have the spinal cord and the brain. But the peripheral nervous system is what we will be focusing on. So we have two divisions here as well. This is the ANS, or the autonomic nervous system. And here we have the somatic nervous system. So talking about the somatic nervous system, the breakdown of these are sensory neurons and motor neurons, which are kind of like our voluntary neurons, what we can use to manually control like our muscles or what we feel in our senses. So here with the autonomic nervous system, which is what we'll focus on, we have two different divisions as well. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So when focusing on these two specifically, the common thought about these are the different types of nervous systems. The fight or flight is what is described for the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system is described as rest and digest. So when talking about the origin of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, here we have a drawing of a spinal cord, and depending on the innervation or the organs that are being innervated, the sympathetic nervous system will span everywhere from T1 to L2. And so the cutoff to where the nerves will go, either above the diaphragm or below the diaphragm, is down here around T6. So all of these nerves will innervate organs that are above the diaphragm, and the nerves that come from here will innervate organs below the diaphragm. And so specifically on the spinal cord here, which is what we have drawn, we have this area of the spinal cord, and the sympathetic nerves will stem from here, what's called the lateral horn, which is right in here. When we compare that to the somatic nervous system, they will stem from the anterior and posterior horns of the spinal cord in comparison. When we talk about the parasympathetic nervous system, those nerves will originate from cranial nerve number 10, and that is where they will all come from. And so when thinking about the location of the ganglia of each one of these nervous systems, besides on either side of the spinal cord, what we have are sympathetic chain ganglia right here on either side of the spinal cord, which will be where the sympathetic neurons will travel to directly from the spinal cord. When thinking about the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are located near the effectors. So if there are nerves going from the cranial nerve to, let's say, the intestines, for example, or the stomach or something like that, the ganglia for those nerves, where those nerves will travel, will be near each one of those effectors. And because there are so many, I won't draw them all out. There are just a lot of different places where the parasympathetic nerves can go, and the ganglia are located near those effectors. All right, so now I'm going to go into the 4 different types of pathways that we see happen within the sympathetic nervous system. So because the sympathetic nerves come from the spinal cord, there are 4 different ways that these nerves can come through, and so I'm going to draw and describe each one of them. So to start off, this neuron will start here in the lateral horn and come down to the sympathetic chain ganglia and will synapse here. And after this synapse, it will leave the sympathetic chain ganglia and it will travel to things like the sweat glands, blood vessels, things like that. And this first one is called the spinal nerve pathway. Okay, so I'm moving on to the second pathway of the sympathetic nervous system. We will start here again in the lateral horn and come down to the sympathetic chain ganglia here. And it will also synapse here in the ganglia and come down this way. And this will then travel to the organs above the diaphragm. More specifically, the heart and the lungs. And this pathway is called the sympathetic nerve pathway. Next, this neuron begins here, goes to the sympathetic chain ganglia, but surpasses this ganglia without synapsing and comes down here to what is called a collateral ganglia. And here there is a synapse, and then it will travel downwards to the organs below the diaphragm. And so this pathway is what's called a splanchnic nerve pathway. And our last pathway will again begin here and not synapse in the chain ganglia. It will pass by the collateral ganglia without synapsing and will travel all the way to the adrenal gland, which is located above the kidney like this. And so here we have a blood vessel. And what happens is this neuron will come in here and synapse in the adrenal gland, which will then release the neurotransmitter epinephrine into the bloodstream. And so this pathway is called the adrenal medulla gland pathway. So each one of these 4 pathways describe the different ways that the sympathetic nervous system can cause these neurons and these signals to travel from the spinal cord to or through the sympathetic chain ganglia to collateral ganglia and to different lungs or to different organs, as well as the adrenal gland above the kidney. Okay, so now I'm going to break down a little bit of the pathways of the neurons in the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So I'll start with the sympathetic by drawing out some pictures here. Okay, so here I'll start with the sympathetic nervous system. What I've drawn here are myelinated neurons. And I'll go ahead and just go through the pathway, the different things that happen in these neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. So this one here at the top, what we have is this neuron will release the neurotransmitter here, which is acetylcholine, abbreviated by ACH. And on this postsynaptic neuron, we have a receptor. This receptor is an inotropic receptor that is N2. And so what happens when N2 is activated, that will open up the sodium-gated channels, which will cause depolarization and an action potential. And so the signal will travel down this postsynaptic neuron down to this area here, which can be labeled our target, which includes smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And so there is another neurotransmitter here that is released, which is norepinephrine. And I will talk a little bit about what happens at the target after this neurotransmitter is released, but first I'll go through each of these types. So in the second type of the sympathetic nervous system, we also have acetylcholine here being released onto another N2 receptor, which will cause an action potential and move down this postsynaptic neuron. And this is going specifically to the general sweat gland. And so what's interesting about this specific pathway is that instead of norepinephrine, we will have another batch of acetylcholine being released onto a different type of receptor, which I will go into in a moment. But for the parasympathetic nervous system, there's only one pathway that we need to talk about, and down this neuron, the neurotransmitter here will be acetylcholine, which will bind to another N2 receptor, which will send the signal down this postsynaptic neuron, which will also release acetylcholine. And here we have the other targets of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the different receptors on these target organs for both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So here, this target for the sympathetic nervous system, we have receptors that are alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. And so all of these receptors can be labeled adrenergic receptors because they bind to the neurotransmitter norepinephrine and epinephrine, which can be found in the adrenal gland. These are also metabotropic, which means that they operate via G proteins. And I will go into what each one of these receptors do, but these are kind of the classifications of the receptors. On this second pathway, the second neuron for the general sweat glands, we have specifically, this is an M1 receptor. When we go down here to the parasympathetic nervous system, we will have similar receptors. We have the M1 receptor, M2, M3, M4, and M5. And these can be labeled cholinergic receptors because they bind specifically to acetylcholine in order to cause different actions in these organs. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of what happens when each one of these neurotransmitters of norepinephrine and acetylcholine bind to each one of these specific receptors that are located on different target organs. So to start out, what we know is that on the heart, we have beta-1 receptors. On the lungs, we have beta-2 receptors, blood vessels. We have alpha-1 as well as beta-2. On the eye, we have two different types. We have the constrictors, which have M1 receptors, and we have the radial muscles, which are alpha-1 receptors. And so what happens is, I will go ahead and talk a little bit about what occurs at each one. So we know that in the heart, if this norepinephrine binds to this beta-1 receptor on the heart, then that will increase heart rate because this is our fight or flight in our sympathetic nervous system. If it binds to this beta-2, it will open up the lungs, allowing the lungs to get more air. If it binds to the alpha-1, it will constrict the blood vessels, increasing blood pressure and sending blood to the muscles. And similar actions will happen with the eyes depending on the receptor. More specifically, when thinking about a few more of these receptors, we have M1, M3, and M5, which will increase IP3, which we know causes a release of calcium. M2 and M4 receptors will cause a decrease in CAMP. And it will increase PDE, which breaks down CAMP. The alpha-1 receptor increase IP3 causes that constriction, which we talked about with the blood vessels. Beta-1 and beta-3 will increase CAMP. Alpha-2 will decrease CAMP, and beta-2 will increase CAMP. So kind of a general rule for these receptors and what they do is that we know that the even numbered receptors are inhibitory and the odd numbered receptors are excitatory.